Alasdair. We're here about painting tents. You should be able to see the background here with all the nice, lovely little presentation, so everybody can follow along and see what we're doing. I have been playing in the SCA now. I started in '94, '95 in the Kingdom of Atenvelt, and played in a couple of different kingdoms since then. I played in Anstiora and, of course, here on Antir. So I am all about the show. I like the pretty. I like the magnificent. I like people to come up and see the encampments and see the background and just be transported back and just come away with a wow factor. So that's much easier to do when you put a little bit more into the tent and all the bright colors, the painting, adding a bit of pageantry, grandeur, making it one of a kind, making it stand out. When I first started, uh, pavilions weren't particularly common. They were not unheard of, but a lot of people were still in Costco garages were pretty common. A lot of people were just in mundane tents. So standing out in a period pavilion was pretty easy. Excuse me. But now that we've seen a much larger uh, portion of the populace able to access tents and more manufacturers out there making them, there's a lot of them out there, and it's just a sea of plain white pavilions that you see. It's nice, it looks great, but there's so much more you can do with it. You can really put your stamp on it. You can get your personal uh, aesthetics out on the field. Also makes it a lot easier to figure out which giant white pile of canvas is yours when you're wandering back in the middle of the night after you've been around partying or visiting with friends or attending various whatever functions are going on. So, first off, surviving tents, we don't have a whole lot of them. There are more of them now than there were years back as the internet is getting into more and more oddball crannies and nooks and things. We find a few more of them that are surviving that we've thought of, and it's easier to see the ones that we have than it has been in the past. Instead of a few static images and shots for publicity that we see, you can see a lot more of walk arounds and 3D images, being able to actually see all the different details of the tents. So it makes it a lot easier to kind of get an eye of what you're looking for. You can still see our best source for information for tents is going to be manuscripts and illuminations. They're in backgrounds, war being a pretty common theme to see, and there's almost always tents in the background. You'll see the decorated tents in the background, and some of that, I'm sure, is to denote whose tent was whose, which we might not have that information anymore, but also to kind of give you a feel for the grandeur and the spectacle. When you see illuminations of tourney that's out there and all the different tents with all the individual and unique different styles of decorations on them. And you don't see a whole lot of plain white tents. Most of the tents, even fairly simple ones in the background, have at least a little color on them. All kinds of different varieties of tents. There's different shapes, different sizes. Again, depending on what you're looking at, where your manuscript is coming from, we're not really looking at going into that here. This isn't a matter of this is my marquee, it's this size, this is how you demonstrate it or how you decorate it. This is just on some of the elements and the basics on how to paint your tent. This is really pretty simple to do. So if you're looking for ideas, you've got your tent, you've got the drive, you want to do this, but now what? How do I decorate my tent? There's some links in the handout to some really good places to go to. A lot of people, if you put any time into working on your encampment at all, have probably come across the House Grey Dragon website. Has all kinds of stuff in there. There's some stuff on tent penning. There's some stuff on furniture, but there's a lot of good information there. The others that are on there are a little bit more, a little less hands-on, a little bit more in-depth, but there's a lot of really good information. I'll let you kind of explore those on your own. The final one is a Pinterest link that was put together by her ladyship, Edith Chelson, several years back when she was helping me with the tent that you see on the top of the handout. I have jokingly started calling it the Taj Maholand in reference to my mundane name being Holland, and I'm a bit of a smartass on occasion. That tent was the second tent I've painted. I've seen a lot of them. I've looked at a few. And putting that one together really kind of had me delving back through and looking at pictures and getting an idea what made up the aesthetic that people were going for. What kind of elements were they using and why did they use them? One of the simplest things you see is a lot of the elements are uh, copied over from architectural elements. You see arches, you see occasionally windows, you see cutouts. You see motifs put in there. You also see heraldic elements as well. You'll see people have mottos on their borders, or they will have painted their devices or their badges on it. Sometimes you can kind of see some that are guild representation, so they're more than one person on there. So there's a little bit of everything. There's a lot of stuff to kind of go for. The easiest to go for is any kind of a repetitive. So again, when we go for the arches, you can see on those that you've got a lot of vertical lines that are then connected. So it makes it very straightforward, very symmetrical. Those of us like myself who don't have a whole lot of talent for painting and for freehand and have horrible handwriting, we can make stencils. We can make easily find ways to transfer there and make them repetitious. Um, So when I set out to do the tent, the first thing we had to figure out is what kind of a medium we were going to use. And there's a lot of different stuff out there. For those with Panther tents, the they have a paint that they recommend. You can do that. I have never personally tried it. The one thing that got to me on that one was it was a small amount and it was kind of expensive. So we started looking around at some of the various other people that had painted tents in the past and getting ideas there. And the big one seemed to be that you wanted an exterior latex paint, regular old latex house paint. For this particular case, we used Olympic Icon paint and primer in one. We went in, we found a color we liked. Make sure if you do that that you save the information for the paint. We ran into a bit of a problem. We ran out of paint on our first coat and had thrown away the empty can and then had to go back in and hope that we remembered the correct color. So just, learn from that trial and error right there. So when you sit down and you lay out your design, the first thing you really want to do is you want to kind of look at your tent as an overall. Is it a solid piece? Are your walls and your roof attached, or uh, do you have separate pieces? In my case, I have a marquee. It's a 20 by 30 Panther marquee that the walls all come out off of. So keeping my walls and my tent painted in consistently with each other, it wasn't quite so important. My walls can move around. I can adjust things as I go. So I basically designed my roof totally independent of my walls. For the roof, it's all pretty much just straight, flat geometrics. There's lines, it's connected. I followed a number of different online examples and laid it out for there. For my walls, I followed some examples. I primarily went with arches and doing the arches and keeping a aesthetically pleasing arch to the vaults that are on there and trying to keep them proportionate with the vertical portions of it. Um, the for the layout, being a woodworker, I do have access to things like large chunks of plywood, so I was able to make a full-size stencil, and I can't tell you how much easier that made it. When I was using a smaller stencil for portions of the roof, and it's only about 3 feet long, and you're doing an 18-foot long ridge, it's a lot of picking up and moving and picking up and moving and picking up and moving, and hoping you got it all straight and it works together. It can work pretty well, and it does work, especially if you've got an older tent like mine where it's stretched a little over time. It's not still in the original straight and square lines. It gives you a bit of playing with, but having the larger pieces to go with means that there's less chance of something slipping and being out of alignment. And then when you put your tent up and look at it and go, oh, okay, I'm now running off down to this side and it looks really weird. So I definitely recommend stencils anytime. Anytime. For outlining your stencils, originally I started using just regular pencil, thinking that my paint would cover it up. Not a problem, be good to go. And after we put the first coat of paint on, we quickly found that that's not the case. Basically, most graphite pencil is going to show through most paint. And once it's on, you're stuck. There's nothing you can do for it. So what ultimately I ended up going for is Crayola colored pencils. Found a colored pencil that was as close as I could get it to the paint color and used that for my lines, and it faded in pretty well. So I was pretty happy with that one. For the paint, as I said, you want an exterior latex paint. You want it to still have a little bit of that flexibility so that when you fold your canvas, it's going to bend and move with the fabric better and not be as prone to cracking. We cut the paint with 1-to-1 with water. So that works really well. It allows it to seep into the fabric a bit better and really kind of get a good hold as opposed to sitting on top of it. One of the questions that was asked the other day was about a newer tent and whether the paint is going to be a problem with waterproofing. To that, I can't tell you. Like I said, this tent, when I painted it, was at least 10 years old. It had seen a lot of use, so I had no problem with it. Most tents, waterproofing does create a barrier for the paint. However, you do still have fabric on the top. You have an open weave, so a thinned out paint should sink in pretty well. The the next thing to consider is break the project down into manageable portions. As I said, I designed my roof and my walls completely separate from each other. So I went through and we laid out the very basics of the walls, or excuse me, of the roof. We did the center ridge line first. We went down and outlined the edges of the roof and painted those out. As I said, it's a 20 by 30 tent. That's a pretty large amount of canvas to wrangle. Luckily, I had a good sized backyard at the time and a 6-foot plastic table. And it really worked well to go through and draw everything out, put all the lines on it, and then go through and start painting. And as we painted one section and slid it off to the side to paint the next section, keeping it nice and flat, by the time we got from one end of the tent to the other, the first section was pretty well dry. So we could go ahead and leave it out for a little bit longer, let everything dry enough that it was going to not transfer too much, and then wrangle a new section of the tent, a new side of the tent up to paint it. And that seemed to work pretty well. We painted that first portion of the tent, and once that was done, we let it dry over the weekend, packed it up, and I believe the next weekend we took it up to a Baroness war with just that first section done. Got lots of oohs, got lots of ahs. It was pretty cool. When you've got that big of a tent, that makes a pretty noticeable impression. And then the next weekend after that, we pulled it out. We laid out some more on the roof. We began putting in the dots and the interlocking zigzag lines and things like that. So we broke it down into manageable portions. We didn't have any one section of the tent that was super saturated with wet paint, and we didn't have anything that was, if we stopped, it was going to look terrible. We broke it down into portions where we could look at it and go, okay, we've done enough as we can for right now. Our tent is still usable. It's not laid up for 3 weeks while we have to go find more paint or while we have to do the next section of it. And that was really it made it less of a daunting task. And when you look at something like this and you think, wow, this is a lot of work to do, doing it in bite-sized pieces makes it so much easier to handle. For the actual paint, as I said, we were using exterior paint. Good brushes are really nice. Don't cheap out on your brushes. You can wash them out. You can use them multiple times. Going for the really cheap brushes, you're going to end up with little pieces of bristles stuck to your tent. You pull that off. Now you got to touch it up again. It's not worth the hassle. Spend the extra couple bucks and buy good brushes. We ended up using a mixture of bristle brushes and the foam brushes. For the initial layout of the tent and the initial layer of paint, the foam brushes work really nicely. They do suck up a lot of paint, but since they're square, you have a consistent line, especially if you're going to be painting in parallel to your seams. Since a lot of the seams are raised, you can literally bump your foam brush up against that seam and run it right down the seam as you go and give you a nice crisp straight line without a whole lot of variance. They don't work so well on your second coat, and you will want a second coat. The paint is going to soak in, but it is going to do so probably not as evenly as you'd like. Second coat deepens your color a bit. It helps to cover any of those spots that you might have missed, little nooks in underneath your seams, things like that. But the paint stiffens the fibers of the fabric of your tent. And trying to use a foam brush on those afterwards, it just rips the bristle brush, or the foam brush apart. So that's really where your bristle brush comes in and its strength right there. Also for larger areas, outline in with the foam brush and then use your bristle brush to lay down larger sections of paint. The foam brushes do wear out pretty quickly. You'll go through a lot of them and probably a lot more than you think you will, but they're pretty cheap. They're pretty easy and they're use, dispose, good from there. Also, one of the things is we went ahead and when we laid out our lines, we based it on the idea of using those widths from the foam brush, laying out my dimensions for all of my work, being able to trace around it with that instead of having a half-inch brush and a quarter-inch line of paint. Then you're sitting there and you're trying to dab in there, and it's hard not to get overflow or untidy bits sticking out. So it makes it really easy. And then you've got your paint down, you've got your brushes, you're good to go. You've got that section done. Inevitably, you're going to have some mistakes. Somebody's, a drop of paint falls weird. The head comes off the brush. The whatever happens. Somebody's hand jogs. It's really good if you can find a closely matching paint, and you can get small testers from most of the big box stores where you're going to get your paint. Find one that matches your canvas pretty well to hide those. One of the questions I see here is, can you use painter's tape? Not really. The problem with painter's tape is it's good on flat surfaces, but fabric doesn't bond to the paint very well. And also you get capillary action where the canvas will actually pull paint under the tape. So it doesn't, you might get some benefit from it, but I find for me, it was just a lot easier to just kind of creep up to my paint line as I go. Once you've gone through and you've got your tester, you're covered up any oopses or anything that you slipped or you just decide you don't quite like. The next thing is to outline. Going through and getting a contrasting color. In my case, the tent is white, the paint is green, and we use black to give some really good sharp uh, marking between them to kind of create a barrier there. It helps to cover up any of the spots where you might have slipped or the paint might have bled a little bit, and where you kind of get just unevenness. It gives some crispness. It really makes your colors pop, and it just kind of overall gives a finished feeling to it. We've tried a number of different things on the tent. There were Sharpie produces a large style paint pen. We used that at first and found that they were expensive at about $10 a pop, and we weren't getting a lot out of them. We were looking at getting maybe 15, 20 feet of line work, and they also weren't staying very consistent. They weren't very dark. It dried to a kind of a slightly purplish color, and that just wasn't quite what we were looking for. We moved over to a liquid pen, a liquid paint ink pen, and it worked really nicely. It was great. It was clear. It did burn through a lot of ink, but the ink was not terribly expensive. The problem was about 2 years after finishing the tent, at a really nicely wet autumn war, I came out of the tent and I turned and looked at it to notice that I had faint, ghostly, gray, purpley lines running down from it as the ink had never completely set. So I would suggest just sticking with paint on this one. Again, you can use a thinner bristle brush, a good quality one, and just take your time going around it. Is really taking your time is the best suggestion I have for laying paint out pretty well. Once you've got, all of that done, then it's just adding additional elements. You might find over time as you go that you've changed. Your arms have changed, or you've added augmentations to your arms, or perhaps instead of it just being your pavilion, now your household is using it, and you want to add some additional stuff to it. You can go through and you can add more. It's not, um, it doesn't have to be a finished process, and you can go a couple of years down the road. Keeping track of the paint color that you're using is nice because then you can go back and buy another can of paint 2, 3 years down the road and add to it. Um, put more stuff on as you like. It's not a really difficult process. It is time consuming and it is somewhat detailed, but it is not out of the realms of possibility for anyone. Anyone can take this and go for it. You can see from the picture there, I've got that huge white space in the middle of my tent. And down the road, that is one of the things that is intended to actually see some additional artwork put up there. Just haven't quite put up yet. Couple of things to think about when you're doing your layout. If you'll notice on the tent for my walls, I have my arches, and then in the gap of the arches, I've got the triquetra there, which is my main charge for my device. If you have detachable walls, I strongly suggest going through with a layout that is not going to be so tied to the roof that you have to set your walls up in exactly the same spot every time or it looks weird. Mine, I have a pretty repetitive motif on the walls, and it's really helped us out over the years as we've changed the layout of how we use our tent. Sometimes, as you can see in the picture, we have it open on a long side as a porch. Sometimes we have it as a deeper, shorter porch on the short side. But being able to rearrange those walls as needed is really nice. The one thing that I didn't think about ahead of time is how my walls overlapped each other. I started on one side, I laid out my design as I went, I put down the pieces as I went, we painted it up, and it wasn't until we were completely done and at our first event that I realized that by starting it on one side of the canvas and going to the other without thinking about where my overlap was, I ended up with a situation where my walls overlap, it's none of my pieces actually match up. So I have a half arch kind of going off into space. So that would be one of the things that I would do a little differently if I could go back and do so. But at this point, I'm pretty happy with it. So uh, that is pretty much what I've got for you. Does anyone have any questions or comments about it? So I have a question here. Any issues with paint cracking, wearing when it's rolled, or stored? I have not had any problems with my tent. Um, Watering it down allowed it to sink into the canvas. I don't have any stiff spots or anything like that. I haven't noticed any spots where the tent seems like it is wearing along the paint lines or where the paint is showing any additional problems from the tent. So there shouldn't be. Just like any time with your tent, try not to roll it or fold it exactly the same way. You do create stress lines in the canvas itself, but if you're like me and I can never remember exactly how I rolled it or folded it the last time anyway, you shouldn't have any problems. Another question, any suggestions paint-wise for people who might have a latex allergies or precautions? Um, I don't know of anyone that's had a problem with latex paint. If you don't want to risk it, that personally, and I completely understand. I would try see what else is out there. A lot of tents are actually latex acrylic, or a lot of paints, excuse me. Um, so I don't know that it would actually set your allergies off, but short of actually sticking your finger in the paint and seeing what happens, I couldn't tell you. Again, many of the manufacturers that are out there will have paints that they recommend for their tents to color them or to decorate them. So there's another option for you there. Have you put any sealer on it, or have you tried that? I haven't. Most of the sealers that are out there usually are somewhat of they change the color, um, and you'll get a slightly different hint or tint of color to the tent. So I haven't done it. Two, I'm lazy. The tent looked fine. The waterproofing on the tent was fine, so I didn't see any need to do so. And three, it's an exterior paint. It's designed to be put on and left, so it doesn't really seem to need to have any additional sealant or finishing work done to it. If I had done so over the black line on there, I might have saved myself the drips, and they're running, but they've faded at this point, and hindsight's always 2020. The very top of this chat, there should be a link to the handout. And if you don't see it there, you can get a hold of either myself or Mr. Stisa, and we can send it to you. Question: have you ever painted on plasticized canvas or nylon tent materials? Someone actually asked that earlier in the day. I have not done so. If you mean plasticized, as in having a plastic or rubber backing to it, no, I haven't. I have actually painted on a plastic impregnated canvas for some dragon wings, and that seemed to work fairly well. It didn't sink in as much to the tent. It took longer to dry than a purely canvas tent did, but it did work fairly well. We're going to go ahead and repost the handout here. And as far as nylon, I don't think that this particular technique would work for nylon. It is a fairly impervious material, and I'm fairly certain that the paint would sit on top of it dry, and then the next time you folded it or rolled it, it would just flake off for the most part. You can give it a try. It's really experimentation is about the best I can do at this point, but I don't think you're going to have a whole lot of luck for that. Suggestions for how to handle painting a tent where the roof and walls are attached, like a Panther Regent. It's hard to get flat. So if you're going to do something like that, I would I would divide the tent into sections. For a Regent, you've got that square, you've got a pretty solid break in there. I would go ahead and get a table, preferably one that you don't mind a little paint getting on, and set it up inside the tent, and then just put the section you want to paint on it. And kick the section, if you're going to paint around the edge of the roof, kick the walls under the tent. Paint the thing, and then the section that you can reach, then let it dry, and then slide it over a little bit more. Let's see. Link the type of paint you used. I don't see it listed in the handout. It is listed on there. It's mentioned it was Olympia paint and primer in one. Olympic Icon paint and primer in one. Pretty much any good quality latex paint exterior should work just fine for you. That's what I used, and I've had good luck with it. Other people I've talked to have used other. As long as it's an exterior paint, it has the UV inhibitors that you want to maintain your color for a long lasting time on there. You should be pretty good with just about anything. Let's see. I have a 24 by 36 Marquee style made from Sunforger canvas that I have painted. I found that some of the paint has sun damaged over the years. Is there any recommendation for sunproofing paint? I don't really have one. After a while, anything's going to fade. If you look at a house, you paint it, and a few years later, you need to paint again. The sun is really harsh. UV goes in, it damages a lot of that stuff. About the only thing I can say is, repaint it. A thin coat, split it 50-50 with water. As far as like a UV inhibitor, I have heard they are out there, but there's not something that I've got a lot of experience with. Ratio for diluting paint, 1-to-1 with water. Let's see. Have you noticed any problem with color fading? I have not. I've been using this tent now for 7 or 8 years, and I have not noticed a significant change in my color. My walls are such that the top part of my wall is usually pretty protected while the bottom's in full sun a lot, and I don't see any real difference. Let's see. I own a cone. What advice would you give me to paint the tip top as it's fairly narrow? I'd fold it in half. Fold it in half and lay it down, paint the top part, and then rotate it a bit and paint the next one. If you do it in 2 or 3 thin coats, as I said, 50-50 water to paint, and give it a couple of coats. You should hide any lines for any drying lines on it. Should turn out pretty well. I can't claim, let's see, thank you for the tips, but making the lines the same width as your foam brush is brilliant. That one was definitely a stolen idea, and I was really glad that we did. It made things so much easier. There isn't an actual link for the handout. It should actually be dropped right into it, and it's been in there a couple of times. It should just say something to the effect of tent painting class. It's painting your tent.pdf. If you click on it, it should actually pop up for you. Again, if it doesn't, you can just post into the chat, and we can send you a copy of it directly. Paint over seams or leave them bare and paint next to them. I painted right over my seams. I didn't see any reason why not to. The extra paint going into the seams, in my mind, is just going to have actually go in and help to strengthen the waterproofing and the holes where your stitching is. The only thing is you got to be real careful to get in there and make sure that your paint is actually in all the little holes and all the little nooks and crannies, so you don't have little unpainted bits popping out through your paint. Let's Problems with waterproofing with Starbright. I am not familiar with that particular canvas. Again, I'm going with a Panther tent, so I use the tent that they have. Um, I don't think you're going to have a problem, but again, just like with most things, find a small inconspicuous spot. If you have sod flaps, start sticking right there, and see if it sticks, see how well it works, and how flexible it is. You know, test out an area. Off topic, will you be doing any woodworking classes for camp furniture? There are some in the line. Mistress Disa is planning all these classes, and there's quite a few things that she's got in the works. There should be a class I'll be doing here coming up fairly soon on seating, chairs, benches, and the lights and the like. So that'll be there. And if anyone has questions or suggestions for classes in the future, either to teach or to that you would like to see taught, by all means, I would put them in here and ask Lisa. She's really accommodating on trying to find people to get in here and spread as much knowledge as possible. Her. Alrighty. Do we have any other questions at this point? Everybody good? I have a Regent. I first had a wedge. At that time, I painted my coat of arms mantle on a canvas that is in the arch. I painted like yours, and when sold, I transferred to my Regent. Awesome. Well, I thank everyone for showing up. And another question here. I'm taking inspiration from a manuscript illustration. How do we scale up a design? That's really going to be a question of what tent you have and what you're trying to do. In my case, like I said, I'm a woodworker. I use CAD programs online. There's a number of free ones that you can find. I measured out my tent and my walls, and I put together a I put together a drawing of what I wanted to do, and then I was able to scale it through a CAD program so that it would repeat nicely on all my canvas. Um, it's really a matter of playing with it as you go and breaking it down, get an idea how large of an area you want. In the case of doing the arches, if you've got a flat detachable.
Oh, there's no people to give him stuff.
Okay, somebody is on here with volume. There we go. So I would suggest taking your canvas and folding it into smaller usable sections that you like. If you've got a 20-foot long wall, maybe divide it up into 2 foot or 4 foot, fold it up into those things, and then kind of lay out from there using those dimensions as to where you're going to go from. I don't know if that helps. Hopefully it answers your question. Let's see. How do I locate future classes? I'm actually in Atlanta. Welcome. Thank you for showing up. There should be a link that Disa will post later today that should have a list of all the classes that are going to be coming up, and hopefully that should help. If you go to look for at Early Sweden on Facebook, she'll have a list of all the classes and when they're scheduled. Yeah, projectors was pointed out are also an excellent excellent medium. You don't have to draw your entire legs if you're just doing a straight line down. You can draw up the arch to the way that you like, and then just project it out, and then just bring your lines straight down. Yeah, stamps souffleurs on canopy dags. You can get a lot of stamps out there. There's also quite a few people who are doing block making classes now. There's no reason why you can't combine the two. Oh, there's somebody with a next one there. We have used wood blocks for other things, but not for the tent. You can get foam stamps at Joann's, Michael's, things like that. It's really a question of how far your imagination and your interest takes you. I would love to see pictures of things people are doing later on down the road. Hopefully, I'll see some more of your tents out at the events, and I won't stick out as one of the only painted tents in Ontario. If you came by and saw my tent at Autumnmore this last year, we had a pretty impressive encampment with Baroness Onherod's painted pavilion up front, and then my monster in the background. So, looks like that's about it. I thank everyone for coming. Hopefully you can use this, and the video should be posted in the next day or two if you want to go back over or have any questions. And feel free to email me personally if there's something I didn't answer, and look forward to seeing them out there.